Okay, so I'm a little bit nervous, so please bear with me. Um, Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry, I shouldn't use that. That wasn't good. Let me start over. Hi, y'all. Really, y'all? That was the best you can come up with. I'm sorry. I'm just blanking. What's the word again? Oh yeah, it's my presentation. What's the word? Gender neutral and inclusive language in Romance languages. So let's get started. A little bit about myself. On a daily basis, I interact with language, whether it's English at school, French in my foreign language class, or Haitian Creole at home. Being a part of an immigrant family from a non-English speaking country of Haiti has definitely shaped the way I approach languages. For instance, I was never really formally taught Haitian Creole. It was just something I picked up on between the conversations of my parents who speak the language fluently. While French was something I was more sat down and um, taught about at school and at home through writing in various textbooks and worksheets. So for me, I kind of approached Haitian Creole as more of a spoken language, while French was more of a written language. And for the gender and gender identity portion of this project, as someone who is currently trying to figure out their own gender identity and someone who is friends with non-binary people, I've always wondered how to address someone who's non-binary in another language, especially in a heavily gendered language like French. But before we can jump right into the Romance languages and the case for making these languages more gender neutral and inclusive, I have a few terms to define. So here are some definitions of a few words you'll hear a lot throughout this presentation. First is inclusive language. Inclusive language is the intentional usage of language that both recognizes, accepts, and represents minority and marginalized communities, in addition to the various characteristics that makes up a person's identity. Inclusive language is, unlike gender neutral language, focuses on many aspects of a person's identity instead of just a certain condition or identifier. However, with gender neutral language, like I said before, focuses mainly on gender. However, as the European Parliament defines, gender neutral language is a part of inclusive language in which it uses non-sexist language that avoids words or speech that may be biased, discriminatory, or demeaning by implying that one sex or social gender is the norm. And lastly, gender identity. Gender identity refers to an individual and cultural understanding, experience, and sense of gender along the gender spectrum. And now I'll be defining natural and grammatical gender. Natural gender refers to the sex of a person, animal, or character. And sex usually organizes people by their bodies and their body parts, unlike gender identities, which is usually based on an individual's understanding of gender. Sometimes natural gender may resemble grammatical gender, but they aren't the same. And the reason why they aren't the same is that grammatical gender is a type of categorization of nouns, other words, a noun class, and it doesn't usually match up with the natural gender of a person or object it's describing. Most of the time in nouns in Romance languages are usually put in the same gender or put in the same noun class because of having a similar meaning or pronunciation. And sometimes having like some sort of relation or correlation with things that are seen as typically feminine or typically masculine. But now a bit of context on these Romance languages. So a common question and complaint that frequently came up when I was first starting to study French was something along the lines of, why is French gendered? Sometimes that would prompt replies and agreement among other students, but I would never really receive a good enough answer from my teacher about this occurrence in French. And later on, I learned the same occurrence happens in many other Romance languages. So why are Romance languages gendered? Well, Romance languages originated from Vulgar Latin, which was widely spoken by everyday people during the Roman Empire. It had a five-class noun system, declension system, and three grammatical genders of the masculine, feminine, and neuter. But after the neuter and the masculine were kind of confused for each other a lot, it was dropped in the 5th century as Romance languages began to evolve after the fall of the Roman Empire, making these languages grammatically different from the Latin language they derive from. And most Romance languages, such as French, Spanish, and Italian, started to develop. They didn't really use the five-class noun declension system, and mainly focused on using two grammatical genders of the masculine and feminine form. So we just learned that natural gender is different from grammatical gender, which is used a lot in language and is just simply used to organize nouns, and that Romance languages, such as French and Spanish, come from an inclusive and accessible language such as Latin. So someone may be asking, what's the problem? Why do we need to discuss creating gender neutral and inclusive alternatives to languages like French and Spanish? Well, it becomes an issue when we start referring to people, and this generic masculine role, which is heavily present in both languages, is brought into question. In traditional French and Spanish, there's the generic masculine, and it works like a little bit like this. So in the case there's an all male group, you would refer to that group using the masculine form. In the case there's an all female group, you would refer to that entire group using the feminine form. However, what happens with mixed groups? Well, in both the traditional languages, no matter the amount, the group would be referred to in the masculine form. So even if there are 10 women in a group, or a few men, or even just one man present, then the whole group would be addressed using the masculine form, despite the amount of women that may be present, or other people who may have other gender identities. And as you can see, this isn't really fair to women who aren't mentioned at all in mixed groups, as well as non-binary people who don't even have a spot or aren't given any recognition in the traditional language. So to solve this problem, people started turning towards gender neutral and gender inclusive alternatives. So let's start with French. In the heavily gendered French language, like I explained before, the masculine form usually precedes the feminine one in adjectives, nouns, while also in groups of people with various genders and referring to those whose gender is unknown. To challenge this dominance of the masculine form in French and make the language more inclusive, people started doubling up, using both the full masculine and full feminine form. For instance, in this little image, in these two sentences, they refer to both the masculine and the feminine form, which can be noted with the E at the end. So instead of using l'étudiant, which would be either a male student or a male student or a student, to address all students, they use the male student form, or the masculine form with the male student, and the feminine form with the female student. However, as challenges arose with the addition of both forms, such as which endings or which genders you would use throughout the rest of the language, people started using a median period or a mid dot to start including both the masculine and feminine endings rather than the full forms. So for instance, here at the bottom, you could see that there's kind of like a period or dot in between various letters. And that's meant to indicate both the addition of both the masculine and feminine form. So for instance, in French, the masculine article would be un, but the feminine article would be une. And to make it more inclusive, they added the median period, which uses both the masculine and the feminine forms or endings. And this is used all throughout the sentence. However, the problem is that you can't really use this in spoken language. It's mainly something that's kind of reserved for written language and social media. And despite these changes to make the language more inclusive, there wasn't any recognition of identities whose genders don't fall into the gender binary. So to solve that came along gender neutral pronouns, a very common and popular one, such as él. However, many issues with that arose too. You have a gender neutral pronoun such as él in French, but the confusion is there isn't really a gender neutral gender form to agree with the gender neutral pronoun. It doesn't exist. So even if I decided to use this gender neutral pronoun, I would have to still choose throughout the rest of my sentence with verbs or adjectives to, I would have to choose either the feminine or the masculine form in the rest of the sentence, even though the person I may be referring to doesn't see themselves as masculine or feminine, or someone whose gender is unknown. So one way people started to combat that is by talking around the gendered language. So that eliminates having to address someone with a specific language. For instance, in this example, where they use the word for person instead of a man or a woman. So even though person itself has a grammatical gender, it doesn't have a natural gender associated with it. So you're talking around the language. And in this last instance with Madame le Ministre, it's showing an example of feminizing titles and job titles and occupations, which, like English, is automatically assumed to be masculine. And the problem with this is that many of the feminine forms of these masculine occupations usually don't give women and men the same positions. So for instance, le ministre means the minister in French, but la ministre means the wife of the minister, which isn't the same as a female minister. So people started deciding to add madame before the word. However, the thing is, having Madame le Ministre or other occupation still associates the job title with the masculine, despite the fact it's being associated with someone who's feminine, who's female or feminine. So by feminizing job titles in general, it allows the language to be more inclusive of female voices and workers. Now, with Spanish. Like most Romance languages, in the Spanish language, the gender form is seen as both the dominant and the gender neutral form. In attempts to make the language more inclusive, the usage of both forms of the masculine and feminine gender become more prominent, as seen here with the green text bubble. However, as doubling up on both genders became clunky and awkward, people started looking for other ways to make the language more gender neutral by starting to find new endings, such as the @ sign or the X, as seen in the red text bubble and the blue one. However, these new endings were difficult to pronounce and include in both everyday language and official government documents. So the @ sign was mainly reserved for online usage or written language, and the X was more mainly used or pronounced in English. So instead, to solve this problem of having no gender neutral ending after the other two endings failed, people started replacing the original endings of the original masculine and feminine endings of O and A with E. Okay, now we'll look a bit into the research I did on language learners and language teachers on this topic. So Initially, when I was looking for sources surrounding this topic, I came across various articles from French and American news sites, as well as language learning sites. And they gave me a lot of information and described in depth a lot of the reactions from France and Argentina's government and youth, in addition to the reactions of native French and Spanish speakers on this topic of making the languages more inclusive. But I didn't get that many perspectives from English language learners or foreign language teachers. So, in addition to using the sources I found, I conducted some research of my own to include these missing perspectives to understand how these changes to French and Spanish affects everyone in the classroom. So, for so the two modes of research I did was that I sent out a survey to high school students, prep students, and it was mainly like an 11 short answer question. Most of them were like to introduce yourself and describe or say which languages you're learning and speaking. And I got about 30 responses. While the other thing I did was that I I interviewed foreign language teachers, one French, one Spanish, as well as a history teacher who spoke another language. So, like I explained a bit before, the easiest way I could get the perspectives of teachers was by doing in-person interviews of foreign language teachers, as well as teachers who spoke multiple languages at my school. And by interviewing these teachers, especially foreign language teachers, I was able to ask and understand how they navigate teaching a heavily gendered language to students, especially non-binary students who identity don't really fit into the gender binary of masculine and feminine, as well as understand how the efforts to make the language more gender inclusive in French and Spanish speaking countries either do or do not translate in the classroom by asking them various questions like, what is it like to teach a different language to students whose identity may fall out of the gender binary? Or if you've heard about any of the changes to the languages you're teaching, have you discussed it with your students and or implemented these changes in the classroom, and what are the ways you've done so? And at the same time, I also want to hear from students and get their thoughts on this controversial topic, seeing if they heard, seeing if any of the changes to this language made any minor or major changes to what they're being taught in class currently and how they speak on a daily basis, or how they speak in general. But I also want to get some insight on how students, even teachers, feel like I also want to get some insight on how both students and teachers felt if they could either express or not express their gender identity in the languages they're teaching, speaking, or learning, by asking questions such as, in what ways do you express your gender identity in the languages you speak and or learning? For instance, what pronouns do you use, gender endings, or other tools do you use to express your gender? And here are some of the key findings and takeaways I found while conducting my research. Sorry, but yeah, okay. So there were various themes and patterns I found throughout both the interviews and the surveys, especially the expression of gender identity. In both the teacher and survey interviews, which were mainly from cisgendered people, I was able to receive a lot of clear responses on like the specific pronouns or gender endings they used in their respective languages. And it kind of felt like when I was interviewing and from the responses I've gotten, to me, it kind of felt like it was an easy answer for majority of the people I was interviewing and asking questions to. And it wasn't like something that was it needed a lot of time to be spent on or dwelt. However, as these images show, this feeling wasn't the same for everyone. And it wasn't a common experience for everyone. So even in a in what seems to be a gender neutral language such as English, people still feel like or students feel like they have trouble, or it takes a while to refer to themselves in a refer to themselves or express their gender identity in a way that feels right to them. Such as in the first image, it says, in English, it's been more simple. It's been more simple for me. They, them almost feels almost completely right compared to various other responses I've gotten where it's just like I use I use he, him pronouns, or I use she, her pronouns, or I would use this pronoun in this language, and they're not. And in last image, it was kind of the opposite, where they feel, well, where they don't completely feel like they can express themselves, and it just seems like they have to just take the easier option rather than taking the more complicated option, which would be truer to themselves, but would be more confusing for others. Like they say, I usually stick with she, her pronouns in the feminine endings because it's less complicated. And this was something I saw a lot throughout my research, like my online research, about how a lot of French speakers didn't feel like they could really express themselves and their gender in French. So they had to like switch to English a lot because it was just too confusing to ask, to talk to others or ask for help, like in certain cases, and explain themselves. While for English, it felt easier and felt like they had a space where they're included and recognized and thought about, but it still felt like it was a kind of a betrayal to their identity or the French language. And in this third image, a student brings up an interesting point, which they said, I don't think I express anything since I'm not speaking it to anyone, to anybody. As of now, I'm only learning it by myself. And it brings into a question of how much we're expressing ourselves in languages that aren't being spoken all the time. So for instance, for me, when I was younger, French was more written, and I felt like, and I feel like I had a similar feeling where I didn't feel like I expressed myself. I was just writing how I was taught to write the language and was taught to write the language correctly, but didn't really feel like I was expressing myself fully, or if I was expressing myself at all. It was just something I just did. And something up that came up, especially during the teacher interviews, when I asked them a lot of questions on their knowledge and awareness of the changes going on in the languages they're teaching about, was whether they've discussed it or implemented it in the work they're doing in the classroom. And I've gotten various responses. And it kind of like made me start wondering and also look onto other sources about like whose language is it, like kind of to say like someone speaking it wrong or someone speaking correct. For instance, in a language learning classroom, the teacher is kind of the one that governs if you're speaking the language right or wrong. But for many people in other that speak the language fluently or speak it in French speaking or Spanish speaking countries, it's kind of the people around them, as well as these bodies that govern the language, such as the Académie Française, which is the French Academy, or the Royal Spanish Academy, who actually govern the language as a whole. However, many of the changes and steps to make the languages more inclusive that I told you aren't really official and aren't recognized by these bodies who govern the language. But by interviewing the teachers, I got in a lot of insight on how they approach these changes, especially of what is correct and what is not. For instance, with the history teacher end, they weren't really like, they don't really teach like a language, especially French or Spanish, but they've experienced learning a different language, and having like the conflict, or having this issue of wanting to be respectful and polite in another country or speaking another language that isn't like regularly owned, because it's heavily tied into the culture and identity of many people who speak it regularly. Um, so, like they said, being perceived as speaking the language wrong, which in this case we were discussing like how these changes to language are official and unofficial, and like how it kind of varies on who knows about these changes and who doesn't. And they also included that, and especially since so many people take offense to this idea of the language, when you're a visitor to another country, you don't want to be perceived as offending them, right? You want to be a good guest and meet their expectations. So it's kind of, even though the language traditionally doesn't really include or recognize a lot of people and their genders, it's technically more correct and technically more respectable to use that, even though it isn't fully accepting or inclusive. And for both the Spanish and French teachers, they said completely different responses. For the French teacher, they were more hesitant about implementing these changes in the classroom. They still discussed it with their students. However, they were more focused on teaching their students what's right, rather like what's right and what's accurate, and like what's considered as like officially in the French language, rather than implementing these changes to make the language more inclusive. While the Spanish teacher, when talking to me, was kind of saying that like their definition of what's correct, or like how they're speaking the language correctly or writing language correctly, has kind of like shifted a lot, and it's kind of looser. So like for instance, if someone who uses he him pronouns is writing in Spanish, and they wrote their entire thing in the feminine ending or use the feminine form throughout, she wouldn't really technically like grade that as wrong. She's mainly focused more, rather than on the gender, as if rather than focusing on the gender, she's more focused on like if the rest of your Spanish is correct and if everything else agrees with that feminine form, and like if what they're saying is still close to what the Spanish language is like. Also, there's this really interesting point of intention versus culture. With gender neutral, like this student brings up, in like the student brings up, in languages, especially non-Romance languages, they're like Ga and English, they're unintentionally inclusive, but that doesn't really translate or reflect the same thing in the culture, which many people and many countries are queer, which can be seen that in many countries, and people are seen or viewed as queer phobic. So even though we have a language that has the language tools to be inclusive and gender neutral, it doesn't really mean that the culture that we're in, or the English culture, necessarily is exactly inclusive or as gender neutral as the language you're speaking. Even this teacher included that even though most of the time in their classes, whenever they're reading text or talking about authors who they explicitly said are female in the beginning of class, or discussed that they're female, they would still be associated with male, like will still be associated as masculine or as a male author. And it kind of just still demonstrates how even though the language has the opportunity to be gender neutral, it doesn't really mean that it will be like that the culture itself in fact is inclusive of everyone. And there's also this topic of grammatical gender versus natural gender. As I explained, natural gender is the sex of a person, or the sex of a person, while grammatical gender is the organization of nouns. And with that, the organization of nouns, like many times people, like especially with this case, associate the natural gender to be similar as a grammatical gender, especially when referring to people. However, the thing is, for many traditional language learners and just traditional language speakers and some language learners, it isn't, it's doesn't see it really as a problem that the languages are exclusive. It's just seen as something that's just a part of the language, and it's something that like isn't meant to be exclusive. It's just, it is what it is. But for other students, for other students, a lot of them picked up on like how, even though this is the way it is, like I still wonder if the language is being more inclusive or is making steps towards being gender neutral and whatnot, and how we can make that changes to recognize other identities rather than masculine or the male identity in languages more. And finally, I kind of just want to, like, I guess, talk upon like this idea of it depends on who. And that can mean a bunch of different things. It depends on the students, it depends on the language teachers. But in this case, I'm focusing on the fact that these two students are both learning the same language. However, how they're being taught, what information and resources they have access to, and what knowledge they have on the language affects how they approach it. So for the first student, they're learning French in school, and they've noticed that there isn't really mention of people who go by they, them pronouns in the language. And they've talked about how this is like, how the language is changing in class, but there's not really much taught in school about how to refer to people with they, them pronouns. While the second student also talks about this topic of referring to someone who uses they, them pronouns. However, they mention the pronouns on and il, which are considered the equivalents as the English equivalent, the French equivalents of they, them in English. And it's really interesting how, even though two people could be speaking the same language or learning the same language, they don't approach it the same way, and they aren't like, and the amounts of knowledge they know on both languages could be widely different despite the fact they speak the same thing. And that's it.